Because another part of what's happening in our brain is slowing down. Without the estrogen to keep it active and keep it engaged, it goes into more of what we call an alpha brainwave, which is kind of like when our computer is just buffering. When things are loading, our brain just goes into neutral.
I hate when the computer buffers. Menopause. Why aren't we talking about this? I'm on a mission that no woman should suffer in silence. I'm on a mission to increase awareness and create a community. I'm on a mission to make this M word mainstream. I'm on the menopause mission. You are a neurotherapist. You're a neurotherapist. What is a neurotherapist?
Well, a neurotherapist is someone that focuses on working with the brain and the nervous system directly.
Mm-hmm. And so what is it that you specialize in particularly?
I work with a lot of different issues and concerns. Trauma is probably one of the biggest ones that I focus on in my practice, but I see a lot of different, what we call mental health type issues like ADHD and anxiety, disrupted sleep, all the things that go along with menopause, for example.
So you do something here called neurofeedback. What exactly is that?
So neurofeedback is kind of like clicker training for your brain. It's giving your brain feedback that helps it move into or guides it into a more regulatory way of being. So it's kind of like returning your nervous system and your brain back to its factory resets, kind of repairing some of the trauma and some of the anxieties and stress that come along the way from the outside environment, but also our internal environment, which is what's going on a lot with menopause.
Very cool. So fascinating.
It is.
How does one get into this realm?
Well, I've had a clinical practice for probably about 25 years, and about it was 2017, so what is that, 6 years ago? My daughter received a concussion and struggled not just with the symptoms, but with the medical system, trying to find help, trying to find therapies that were going to help. She developed a chronic headache, and we just couldn't find really anyone that was able to help her with that. And one thing led to another. We ended up down in the States for some testing, and they were the ones that recommended neurofeedback. So when we came back to Canada, we investigated it. And I'll have to admit, when I first met with someone and kind of heard a little bit about it, it didn't really make a lot of sense to me how, watching something on a screen can actually retrain your brain. But we decided to give it a try, and within a session or two, the pain, which had been there for almost a year nonstop, started to subside. And after a few more sessions, it continued to get better. And, after a couple of months of neurofeedback, she was basically back to her old self.
Wow.
It was amazing. So at that point, I realized there was something about this thing called neurofeedback that I needed to learn about. And the more I learned about it, and the more I learned how it can really help with trauma in specific, I just felt like it was something that I needed to add into my practice. It was like the missing piece I was looking for.
So fascinating. So how does it work?
So basically we hook on some sensors called electrodes, which read your brain waves. And your brain waves are the electrical discharges of your neurons. So our brain speaks in two languages. It speaks in chemistry, which are the neurotransmitters, which is what medication tends to focus on. And it also speaks in electricity. So the sensors read the different brain waves, feed it into the computer, and then the computer provides you with feedback, again, guiding your brain into the more regulatory spaces that we want it to be. So it's all a natural process. It's just a learning process that your brain is doing on its own in response to the feedback. We're not putting any kind of electricity or stimulation into the brain. It's just your brain learning how to regulate itself.
Fascinating. And so you're on the machine. How many sessions does it take, or how long does it take to kind of see results, or what is that?
Well, you're hooked up to the sensors for, usually sessions are about 30 to 45 minutes of actual training. And it just really depends on your nervous system. It depends on sort of what the issues are. But lots of times people feel a difference, a shift within just one session.
Wow.
And, for longer, issues like anxiety and trauma, obviously it takes a larger number of sessions, maybe 20 or 30, to really get some significant change. But again, after a few sessions, people are starting to feel better. Maybe they're starting to sleep a little bit better, maybe feeling a little bit more energy, a little bit more executive function, which helps them maybe go out for a walk a little bit more, eat a little bit healthier, have a little bit more impulse control, and it just creates a positive feedback loop instead of the negative feedback loop that we often get stuck in.
That is amazing. So you also have a lived experience of going through the menopause transition.
I do.
What did that look like for you?
Well, it was confusing. It was hard because I didn't have really anyone to talk to. My mom, my grandparents had both passed away, so I didn't have that female mentor to kind of share those stories about what that was like. And honestly, had they been alive, they probably wouldn't have been that sharing anyways.
Why is that?
I don't know. I think that was just, if it was the era that I grew up in, or just the narratives that my mother and grandparents kind of grew up in, we just didn't talk about that stuff. Even I remember getting my period for the first time, and my mom just was extremely awkward and just kind of handed over some pads and, asked me if I had any questions, hoping that I didn't, and just let me go on my way, making do with the, half-hour little conversation we had in health class back in the day. We didn't have the internet, so we just had to rely on what the health
worksheets.
Teacher. Yeah, basically.
So when I was going through puberty, my mom left a book on my bed. And it was a cartoon book, right? So that was the explanation of the birds and the bees. And it was the same thing. With health class, you had a lot of teachers that may have been quite embarrassed to talk about the body parts and such. And so you'd use a worksheet where you'd have to point things out where you're seeing imagery of the opposite sex, probably for the first time, right? But there was this avoidance, and there was this mentality of, we don't talk about those things, or it's not appropriate, and thus creating a whole bunch of shame in and around our bodies and what they naturally go through, which of course is puberty, and then potentially pregnancy, and then into perimenopause, eventually menopause, and then postmenopause. But it's going to happen to every woman. We're going to go through it. So we need to be talking about this more.
Absolutely. I see so many women coming into my practice experiencing what I call brain health, getting away from this notion of mental health. And they have no idea that some of the symptoms that they're experiencing and some of the struggles, a lot of the struggles that they're experiencing, are because of the menopause transition, because no one's talking about this. I honestly learned more there's a lovely little YouTube video that's a parody of Bohemian Rhapsody. I would encourage everyone to look it up. It's hilarious, but it's also incredibly educational. And that was, honestly, I learned more from that video than from any of the women in my life, even my family doctor. So we need to start having this conversation, and we need to start normalizing this narrative so that women are educated and they're not afraid to bring it up, and they're not afraid to talk about all the difficulties, not just with our physical bodies, but our sexual health, our emotional health, everything.
Yes, we are making the M word mainstream. That's what we're doing here.
Awesome.
So you didn't have anyone to talk about what you were going through with, and that sounds like a really, really similar experience to what I went through. So I definitely was struggling with adrenal burnout, and I have hit burnout many times. Little did I know that was going to lead to earlier symptoms and more magnified symptoms of menopause, which I later learned through my naturopath, because it's all connected. But my mom passed away when I was 24 years old from breast cancer, and then my grandmother passed away this past year. So I really didn't feel like I had those women, those mentors, those matriarchs to turn to in regards to my family history and my family health. And then on top of it, when you feel like you're going crazy, you don't want to bring attention to that, because one is embarrassed and shameful and afraid of being locked up, frankly,
Yeah.
So when you feel so alone, I think it exacerbates the symptoms as well.
It does.
Because you're suffering in silence.
Yeah. And you feel like there's something wrong with you. You feel that sense of shame. that probably traces back to other experiences as well, and becomes your whole narrative around that.
So, other than the YouTube video that you were able to turn to, were there any other things or people that created support or solace for you? Is there anything else in your journey that you found to be helpful?
Honestly, just doing my own research and understanding, again, from the brain's perspective. You talk about, feeling like you're losing your mind, and our brain does have a mind of its own. So when you understand the brain changes that go on through the menopausal transition, it makes a lot more sense. And from there, I was able to have deeper conversations with girlfriends, with friends, and start to begin to have those conversations and make it more mainstream, make it okay for women to talk. And honestly, talking to clients is probably the other area where I learned so much, because when we're in the safe therapeutic space, they're able to open up and talk about their experiences and be vulnerable. And I always learn as much or more from the people that I work with than the books I read or the classes I take or the degrees I've got. So I learned so much from the women that I've been able to talk to.
And we like to talk, women. We like to talk to each other in safe spaces. We like to share stories, and I feel like that's how we really get connected. So let's dig in. What happens to a woman's brain during menopause? What's going on up here?
So many things. First of all, probably the biggest thing are the hot flashes, because the hot flashes are a result of, everything is a result of the drop off of estrogen. Our estrogen supplies drop by about 65%. And estrogen, as much as it plays a role in our reproductive system, it plays a huge role in our neurological system, in our brain, in our nervous system. So when we lose that estrogen, first of all, it messes up with the structure of our brain, how it's functioning. So one of those things is hot flashes. And hot flashes are basically our hypothalamus, which is our sort of our brain's thermostat, getting confused and getting hypersensitive to small little changes and going into this response, which is the hot flash. And it's fine if you're driving down, on the road in the winter and you can just roll down the window, or you're home and you can go outside. But when you're trying to sleep and you're having repeated hot flashes, it's interrupting your sleep. And sleep is one of the most productive things, if not the most productive thing we do all day. So when your sleep is constantly getting interrupted every hour, every couple of hours, you're not getting the sleep that you need. You're not getting the REM sleep, you're not getting the deep sleep. And so your body doesn't restore itself, your brain doesn't restore itself, you're depleted. The next day, it makes it harder to think, it makes it harder to focus, it makes it harder to manage our emotions, it's harder on our immune system.
You're describing my health, my life right now. This is my life right now. It's this uninterrupted sleep. I thought I was past that once my child didn't get up through the night, but it all comes back. It comes back around, or it can, at least if that's something that you experience. So the hypothalamus is getting confused, which of course is directly, it's all about the brain, it's all about our chemistry, and we're getting these hot flashes. So what else happens?
Well, the drop in estrogen as well impacts our neurotransmitters, so our dopamine, our serotonin, norepinephrine, which are key neurotransmitters in the function of our cognitive parts of our brain. So being able to focus, being able to concentrate, being able to do our executive function, which is keeping things in order, keeping things organized, deciding what to make for dinner at the end of the day, getting our kid out to their activities. All of that gets impaired because our brain isn't able to keep up with the tasks that it needs. It also can't regulate its emotions like it used to without those transmitters, because again, those are important chemical components to our healthy brain function. So everything suddenly becomes harder.
It's harder. I'm getting emotional. It's just finding my keys, losing my phone, deciding what I'm going to wear, articulating sentences. And I just sometimes feel like I'm shorting.
We basically are. And a lot of those things have to do with memory, but they're a lot about just being present. And when our brain can't be present, because another part of what's happening in our brain is slowing down. Without the estrogen to keep it active and keep it engaged, it goes into more of what we call an alpha brainwave, which is kind of like when our computer is just buffering. when things are loading, our brain just goes into
I hate
neutral.
when the computer bumpers. It drives me crazy. This is what's happening upstairs. I have the rainbow circle happening on upstairs. That's what's going on.
Exactly.
It's just spinning.
So you go to try to find your keys and your brain can't even remember what it's looking for because it's just idling. And that gets in the way of so many things.
Yeah, and as much as I think for me, in my lived experience, this is where I have felt most impacted. And then, of course, the depression and anxiety. So I'm really struggling with mood, and even in times and areas where, like the spring and summer, where I'm active and I'm excited and usually I'm lit up. Last year in June, I sunk as low as I think I've ever sunk in my life. And I was in bed for 2 days, not wanting to get up, not wanting to go on.
Because all of those things take energy. They take brain energy. And when our brain is tired and fatigued, that's where we start seeing things like depression and lack of motivation. Not because, that's a symptom of depression, but it's because our brain doesn't have the energy that it needs to do those things. We need energy to feel good. We need energy to fall asleep. We need energy to do all of those things. So those things are things that we take for granted when everything's working well, and things that probably, really served you well and was part of your, maybe some of your superpowers to be able to function quick and make decisions quick and work all day and then still be able to, come home and make your kid dinner and, do this and do that. But when everything starts to slow down, it's like slogging through molasses. Everything takes so much more energy, and our brain just doesn't have the energy. And then you add the disrupted sleep on top of that, it just becomes a vicious cycle. And it's no wonder that we feel, like we can't get out of bed, because that takes a lot of mental energy, cognitive energy. It takes motivation. It takes planning. It seems like a simple thing because we do it, every day from the time we're 3, but it takes a lot of brain energy. And our brain uses, I think, like 2/3 of the amount of energy that our body produces in a day. So it's a very energy heavy organ. And when it's lacking that energy, we start noticing those deficits.
Yeah, I just feel so tired. I'm just so tired.
I think a lot of women feel very tired. That's often what they come in and present with. And with doctors, when you go in and tell your doctor, I'm tired, you either get an antidepressant because you must be depressed. They don't really stop and take into account, is it ADHD? I have a lot of women with ADHD that go to their doctors because they're incredibly fatigued and tired at the end of the day, that they can't go to the gym. They can't, do any self-care because they're so fatigued. And again, they get given an antidepressant, which that's not the issue. It's, maybe ADHD, it's maybe menopause, it's maybe a combination of those two, it's maybe disrupted sleep on top of that. Mm-hmm. But I think for women in particular, we often get labeled as, oh, it's just depression. Even my daughter with her concussion, that was what the doctors kept saying, well, it's because you're depressed. Well, no, actually she's depressed because of the chronic pain and the concussion, not the other way around. Yeah. But I find our medical system is very quick to label women as depressed.
Interesting. Sleep. So that can be hugely impactful for a lot of women transitioning. Tell me about that.
Well, sleep is really the most productive thing we do all day from our brain's perspective, from our nervous system's perspective. We need to go into the right amount of REM sleep and deep sleep at the right times at the night in order to restore our nervous system. One of the most important roles of sleep is to repair and consolidate memory. And that is definitely one of the things that a lot of women suffer and struggle with through menopause is memory issues. And it's largely because we're not sleeping. If we don't get big chunks of sleep, 3 to 4 hours of sleep at a time, even 5 to 6 sometimes is optimal. When we're only getting maybe an hour at a time, our brain does not have time to go into the natural rhythms of light sleep, into REM sleep, into deep sleep. And when we're not getting REM and deep sleep, we don't get the memory consolidation. So our memories just, they're not formed. So when we get up the next morning and our partner or our daughter asks us about this thing that we had this conversation about yesterday and we don't remember, it's because our brain didn't do its work at night to consolidate those memories. But sleep is also important for our immune system, for our blood sugar regulation, for our cardiovascular health. So it impacts so many other systems in our body that then, we're maybe gaining weight, we're maybe having heart problems, and women also, when they get older, have a higher incidence of heart issues, of cardiovascular disease, of immune system responses. So it really does impact everything. From a brain's perspective, memory is probably the biggest part of sleep. But also, the cognitive, emotional piece as well is important. When our brain's not restoring itself, it really can't function the next day. And it just creates a vicious cycle because our brain needs energy to fall asleep. And that's where it becomes chronic, this chronic insomnia where we just aren't getting good sleeps. And that is a very tricky thing to repair.
Can neurofeedback help with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one of the things it does really well is helps restore the balance and it restores a lot of the functioning, but sleep is one of those things that it works very well for.
So how do we get through this? What can help with resetting or leveling out or?
Well, I think a lot of things. I think beginning to have these conversations is really important so that you don't feel like you're losing your mind, so that you can go to these symptoms and be like, oh, okay, this is menopause, because that takes the shame away. And if you can navigate through this transition without this huge layer of shame, that for a lot of women doesn't just start with menopause, it starts back in childhood or in bad relationships or what have you. This is just one more thing to pile on. So if we can start having this conversation and women can start to learn that, oh, when I start to feel anxious all of a sudden when I've never felt anxious before, or when I can't get out of bed, when that's never been my norm, then we start to question, okay, what else is going on? What else? And this is not an issue of mental health. We need to get away from this dichotomy that separates mental health from physical health, because this is brain health. And last time I checked, our brain is an integral part of our physical body. Right. So we need to start addressing it from the brain's perspective. So we need to start working on our sleep. We need to talk about, okay, what's going on in our sleep that we can fix? Is it an overactive bladder? Is it the hot flashes? What can we do there to give ourselves a better sleep? What can we do to get some support, to get some help around this, so that someone else can give us a hand when we, can't get up that morning and, our child needs to get to volleyball practice or school or what have you. We need to be able to normalize some of this so that at least we're just dealing with the physicality of it then. We're not dealing with this sense of shame and not good enough and all of the other layers that get put on top.
Yeah, the stigma. And it's interesting because there's also this, if you look at folklore, for example, anytime you talk about the elderly woman or, anything that's in the more of the mature or menopausal phase, right? It's that old hag mentality. It's that worthlessness they're expired. They no longer can procreate, and what do they have to give? What value do they have to provide? And I think that there is an ancestral and societal stigma that comes with that too. Being Absolutely. An older woman.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Not being as attractive, not being as desirable, and not being as valuable.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're starting to see some transitions away from that, where
Yes.
more and more women are deciding not to have children, and we're starting to see value in women outside of just reproduction.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to help us understand that menopause is not just a change in our reproductive status, it's a change in our brain, it's a change in our body as well.
So we've talked about the hypothalamus, we've talked about the lowering levels of estrogen and how it decreases all of those different hormones. What else happens with the brain through menopause?
Well, it changes its structure. It actually loses gray matter, which are the neurons, the brain, the cells that process information. Wow. The connectivity, so the white matter, the cells that actually connect those neurons and brain cells, starts to kind of fall apart, I guess, because it's not getting the nutrition that it needs. The glucose metabolism falls off. So we actually lose volume in our brain as well. It restores itself post-menopause, but during that transition, again, we're actually losing mass in our brain, which again makes when different areas are not able to communicate clearly and enough, again, we start to have difficulties with focus, with concentration, with emotional regulation, with all of those things. So that's a part of it.
I just feel like an emotional wreck. I think I cry every single day. And it's not necessarily out of sadness or anger or resentment, although I do have my share of those emotions. It's also the joy. It's also the love. It's also, whereas before I've definitely always been a sensitive human being. I was scolded and shamed for that when I was younger. I've since embraced it. But the feels are at a whole new level. They're just at a whole new level. They are so heightened. It feels like a bit of, kryptonite and superpower at the same time, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we need to start seeing it as that. We are very good at seeing the negative parts, the deficits, the impairments of that.
Right.
But we need to start turning that around and see that as a gift. How can we use that? How can we use our emotion to motivate us, to share with others?
Yeah. Well, that is exactly why I'm trying to open up these conversations so that we can encourage them to occur more and more, creating that community, creating that openness for even more conversation. It's that ripple effect, right? So you mentioned in postmenopause that the brain eventually goes back or gets kind of larger again, or whatever that may look like. So there's hope.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
Oh, thank gosh. Okay, so we're going through menopause, we're going through all of this, and a lot of these symptoms can occur depending on your lived experience through peri and into, menopause is actually just the one day, which is the 365 days without a period, and then we're in the postmenopause. But how do and when do things start to regulate? What does that look like? What's happening up here?
I think that can depend for every woman because, again, our brain and our nervous system does not exist in isolation. And I think menopause amplifies all of this, as you mentioned. You maybe had some experiences with anxiety in the past. I know a lot of women have pretty strong trauma histories. You mentioned adrenal fatigue. So if you're getting to that place where your adrenal system is fatigued and your brain maybe isn't operating optimally to begin with, and then you go through this menopause transition, that's, almost adding fuel to the fire. Mm-hmm. So it's not always an easy or a quick fix to go back and just fix the menopausal stuff. We have to go back and start having conversations and start looking at, other health professionals like naturopaths that look at our whole body and help rebuilding some of those things, rebuilding our adrenal system, talking about trauma, processing our trauma, talking about anxiety and depression, coming up with ways to support each other, to, go out and go for a walk, to call, a friend when you're feeling down and go, have coffee with them. We need to start really addressing our health in general, not our mental health or our physical health separately, but our health. And that takes a varied approach depending on what you're going through. Like I said, we have to sometimes unpack a whole lot because for most women, when they're going through this transition, I think, for me anyways, my daughter was at the later stages of puberty, but going through menopause at the same time your child's going through puberty is a very difficult thing to manage. So sometimes we have children and issues with our family that we have to work on. A lot of us are, people are caring for aged parents. Mm-hmm. So they're in that sandwich generation where they have a lot of stress on themselves. And so this is just one more thing, again, that makes everything else harder. So maybe it means getting their husband, getting their sister, getting their next door neighbor to come over to help with these things, to seek professional help. Go talk to a social worker, a psychologist, a therapist. Go see a naturopath. There's a lot of things that can be done mm-hmm. that aren't just going to our medical doctor, which is, you know, in my case, all she did was ran the blood test and yeah, boom, okay, you're through it. Congratulations, but that was the end. There, you know, that was the beginning and the end at the same time of our conversation. So
Wow.
again, I think it starts by having more of these conversations, making it more normalized, and seeking professional help. There's a lot of professionals out there that are experienced with this, and it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to be vulnerable and say, I'm struggling with this. I feel like I'm losing my mind. You know, it's okay to have those conversations and seek out those professionals.
Yeah, permission. So it's funny you mentioned going through menopause at the same time as puberty, because that is exactly my world as well.
Oh.
So I have a 13-year-old daughter, and she has definitely embarked on puberty in a bigger way. I mean, it was less, but it was still there last year with 12, but 13 hit, and holy Toledo. Our home is actually just called the hormone household because between her and I, it's just this tornado of emotions and emotional deregulation, if you will. And we're helping each other, which is also really beautiful. And I think we have more grace with each other because at any given time, one of us can say, you know exactly what I'm going through, because it's just the hormone shift, but in opposite, right? And so we're seeing that incline, everything kind of incline in her and everything decline. But I don't think that I could have ever possibly understood the ramifications of hormones on the body and how important hormone health is, and how significantly they can impact you and what role they play. Like,
Absolutely.
It's wild.
Even in menstruating women and you know, girls, that week before their period is a little mini experience very similar to menopause, because again, their estrogen levels drop. So whether you know you have ADHD or not, I work with a lot of people with ADHD, so that's often my reference point. Their focus gets worse. Their concentration is more impaired. Their memory is more off. Their emotions are more dysregulated. So, you know, for someone with ADHD, those things get heightened even more. But for someone, you know, that is neurotypical, they still experience, you know, that we often see the emotional dysregulation because that's what impacts us more. That's the louder part of our brain dysregulation. But most girls and most women, menstruating women, when they go through that week before their period, when their estrogen levels drop, they're also having trouble with memory. They're also having trouble paying attention in class or at work. They're having trouble getting things done at the end of the day. So they're also experiencing, you know, a somewhat similar experience. So maybe you guys can, you know, help each other out, like you say, and relate. And, you know, again, having that conversation, letting her know what's going on for her during this week will also lead to a better understanding when it's her time to go through the transition and go, oh, okay, this reminds me of, you know, back when I was younger and this happened and this other thing happened and, you know, it was hard to write an exam that day or...
Oh, she will know that, remember what it was like to go through menopause with mom. This has been unforgettable. Unforgettable. Yes, it's just wild at times, but there is definitely a lot of comfort and solace we find in each other, and I think that more and more women will find in each other when we share similar experiences and such. So, ADHD. I have never been diagnosed. I've only begun to research as it's coming more and more into my world and into my vision. And I do believe, just looking at a lot of the stuff and the tests that you can do, that this is something that I likely have struggled with my whole life. And maybe not struggled with, because I coped with.
Yeah.
I got through. Now I'm finding a lot of those said symptoms to be super, super magnified. And from what I have read is that can occur during menopause because there is so much brain health and brain shifting involved. So how would one explore that and discover that? And how do you test for that?
Well, there's different ways to test for that. And it's not uncommon to see that these, what we call ADHD struggles, get amplified during menopause. First of all, I mean, ADHD is sort of a construct created by the DSM-5, which in my opinion is a bit antiquated. It's not really based as much as it could be on current neuroscience research. A lot of the diagnostic criteria for what goes into most of the things in the DSM-5 were created by men based on research by usually little white boys, and it doesn't generally apply to women as directly, and certainly diverse women. So what we call ADHD in the DSM-5, and that's the label we often go with, is that sort of impaired focus, impaired concentration, impulsivity, maybe some hyperactivity thrown in there. But that isn't how women present with ADHD. And when you start looking at how women present with ADHD, women don't get picked up. Girls definitely do not get picked up and brought in and assessed for ADHD because we have other ways of coping with some of those struggles. We are usually the last people in a classroom that want that attention. We have this, what people will call people-pleasing sort of aspect of it. To me, it's just being relationship-based, relationship-wired. So when we interact with relationships, in the context of relationships, we don't want to disrupt things. We don't want to upset our teachers or our bosses or our partners or whoever. So we stuff that stuff in, we internalize it, we put it somewhere so that it doesn't come out. And
often less diagnosed.
Absolutely. And again, we have more of the emotional dysregulation just because, again, we're more emotional creatures, maybe because it's okay for girls and women to be more emotional. So then again, we get labeled as, well, she's just being emotional. But again, so many women present with these symptoms and they get labeled as depressed. And they're given an antidepressant, and then they're on antidepressants for the rest of their lives. And that's not really solving the problem. It's just masking some of the symptoms, maybe. So in order to sort of delve into that a little bit deeper, you can get an assessment, usually by a psychologist. I would encourage, if you're a woman, to go to, maybe at least someone informed on the differences of how women present, because women don't always meet the diagnostic criteria of the DSM-5 because of those reasons. And there's only recently starting to become more and more research around women's experience with anything, whether it's ADHD. We know we're starting to learn that concussion injuries are different for women because of our hormones. Everything is different from a women's perspective, and yet there's no research on that. There's not even research on menopause. I mean, there's a little bit out there, and there's starting to be more, but it is vastly under-researched. How do women with ADHD go through menopause? Is it different than neurotypical women? How do diverse women experience menopause? There's beginning to be some research that suggests that women of color experience a lot of these symptoms more intensely, especially the hot flashes. So why is that? What's going on there? We definitely need to advocate for more research so that we can understand this, because the medical system gets very sort of anti-TikTok and anti-social media. But honestly, where else do we go for information right now? And there's some, not so great resources out there in social media, but there's a lot of really helpful resources as well. And until the medical system can catch up, that's kind of all we've got. So, I would encourage women, if they're having these struggles, to reach out to someone, a psychologist or a physician, a psychiatrist even, that can diagnose these, that has some understanding of how women present differently. Or, neurofeedback, neurotherapy assessments are a very objective measure of brain health, because when you go to a psychologist, when you go to a psychiatrist, they're going to ask you a lot of questions. You're going to rate yourself from 0 to 5, and it's all subjective. And some studies show that subjective measures are right maybe 50% of the time. And again, if you've done the reading and you really feel strongly that this fits for you, if you go into your doctor's office and say, I think I have ADHD, I want some medication, or I want to talk about this, it depends on your relationship with your doctor. You're either going to be received well or you're not going to be received well. And so that's, again, one of the values that I see in the brain assessments, in the QEEG or the EEG assessments that I do, is it's an objective measure of your brain health. It's not me, skewing the results. It's not your subjective experience. It's an objective measure of how your brain is functioning. And it's not always going to fit into the little boxes of the DSM-5 because, again, we know more about the brain. We know more about our bodies than what the DSM-5 makes us sort of think.
What happens, to wrap things up, what happens in postmenopause with a woman's brain?
Well, some of the things return back to normal, and some of the studies show that our cognitive abilities, are the same as they were before. They're strong. We get our memories back to a certain degree. We get our cognitive function back. The emotions still might be there, because that's kind of who we are. The one thing that often is a really tricky thing to repair is our sleep, because when our sleep has been disrupted for so long, it becomes the norm, and sleep is an incredibly difficult thing to get back on track. Mm-hmm. And it's not just our brain there, it's our overactive bladder, and there's other things through menopause that affect our brain health that's not specifically tied to our brain. Things like our sexual health changes. And our sexual health is an important part of our general health. And, whether it's pain because of vaginal dryness or, again, trauma coming up that we haven't processed, those things impact those day-to-day experiences that we need to be healthy. Mm-hmm. So again, it's opening up this broader conversation of what does it mean to move into this elderhood of being a woman, and what can that look like? Not in a negative way, but what does this mean for us? What can it mean? And seeing it in a positive, hopeful, optimistic light.
Yeah, to be celebrated.
Yeah, it's like a new beginning. It's not an ending. It's a beginning, I think.